Good morning and welcome to this Daily Mirror Facebook Live event on the jobs crisis. I'm Kevin Maguire and we're joined in conversation with Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister and Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, longest serving Chancellor in modern history, Gordon.
Yes, 10 years. And the last one who served longer than me was in 1820, and he abolished income tax to enable them to stay on. So I wasn't able to do that.
No, I think
I usually see you also on GM television, and then I see you on Sky in the evenings. You're on television more hours a day than anybody I know.
You've got to put in a shift, Gordon. You know, a lot of people doing it. You always had a work ethic yourself. But Gordon, right. You've launched the Alliance for Full Employment. The Daily Mirror has got the Keep Britain Working campaign. They both dovetail, because the coronavirus is throwing up a potential employment calamity, with unemployment now around 1.4 million, forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility to go as high as 4.1 million. Other forecasters put it lower, but nevertheless, unemployment is going to soar unless something is done to keep people in work, training, apprenticeships, and so on. Tell me about your campaign and the importance of people remaining in work and keeping Britain working.
Well, Kevin, we've got to come together. The whole country's got to come together. This is the biggest employment crisis we faced probably for 80, 90, 100 years. And it's a once-in-a-century event we're facing. And I feel sorry for all those families who've been hit by the virus and who are still in fear that they may be hit by the virus. But we have got to make sure that we keep as many jobs in being as possible. And we've got to create new jobs for the new challenges, like on the internet and online services that are going to be met. And we've got to recognize, look, I've been looking at what's happening to people in the country. You know, 1,000 people applying for a receptionist job, one job in central London, 1,500 applying for another job in the Midlands, 2,000 applying for one single administrative job in Coventry, 2,600 applying for a single Sunderland factory job. It's like the lottery, that the odds against you of getting a new job are so tough, and particularly for young people so tough, that you look at the figures for the numbers of people who've lost their jobs, and that's about 700,000 in the last few months. You look at the projections that you've already mentioned. You look particularly young people half of young people may not have a job if they're not in full-time education. And so you've got a crisis emerging. We had a problem in 1997 when we came in because we had to solve youth unemployment. We spent months, we spent hours working on a program, and it was successful. Then in 2009, we had the Future Jobs Plan. What I want to see is the same amount of energy and the same commitment to keeping people in jobs that we had then. So we kept unemployment down. Probably it was 1 million less than it might otherwise have been. And we've got to do the same thing now. When it's such a lottery to get a job, we've got to create more vacancies, and we've got to keep people in work. And what's really brilliant is that since we launched this campaign, and we had Andy Burnham from Manchester, we had Steve Rotherham from Liverpool, we had Jamie Driscoll from Newcastle, we had Dan Jarvis from Sheffield, we had Mervyn from Bristol, we had Sadiq Khan in London, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Draper, and me from Scotland and the Scottish Labours. So we had all these people coming together in knowing what's happening in their own region and nation, and knowing this is a crisis that is not properly understood in Westminster and in Whitehall at the moment. The scale of it is not understood. And then today, you may have seen it's reported, 1,200 councillors, led by a great councillor from Norfolk, who's led this, and 1,200 councillors. They know what's happening in the local communities, the fears that people have, the worries, the anxieties, and they know that unless we act in the next few days, we've got to deal with this furlough that's got to be extended in some sectors, and also in places where there's local lockdowns, and we've got to deal with the problem of youth unemployment, and we've got to deal with the problem of creating jobs.
Do you fear, Gordon, that unless the government grasps the scale of the crisis and takes the action to deal with that crisis, we could return to the 1980s when unemployment hit 3.2 million? I think it was 11.9% at the peak. That's more than 1 in 10 workers. The Paris-based OECD group of richer nations is predicting it could go as 11.7%, just below that level. Now the workforce is bigger, so the total would be larger.
They've got a report out this morning, the OECD, they're the richest countries. Now, the richest countries are predicting nearly 10% unemployment and 8% by the end of next year, that people's incomes are going to go down to the levels of 2016. So your incomes are going to go down. And that's why, I called for the government to act on jobs and to create a furlough scheme right at the beginning of this crisis. And to their credit, and the unions were involved, employers were involved, they did. So there was a furlough scheme. I don't think they're as prepared for the next stage. I think they're not prepared for the recovery phase. And I don't think they've thought out the jobs plan for young people. I don't think they've thought out that we need to extend the furlough in key sectors. And I don't think they've thought out what kind of jobs we can help create for the future. There are going to be zombie companies that cannot survive other than through the loans they've got, unable to invest in the future, unable to employ people. It's going to be a major crisis for lots of companies, and they'll be laying off thousands of people in the next few weeks.
Now, Gordon, we want this conversation to be shaped by people who are watching, listening now. They send in their questions. I'll put them to you. Why do you think the government, the UK government, has gone for short-term measures so far? The furlough scheme, incredibly successful, due to end on Halloween, could be a Halloween horror. France and Germany, they've got 2-year programs, because I've heard you argue, and Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC, made the same point earlier this week, that the furlough scheme might end on October the 31st, but the pandemic isn't going to end. And the economic impact, and the impact on employment, impact on wages, impact on families is going to continue. But at the moment, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak's talking about coming up with some innovative future solution, but he doesn't say what that is. Why do you think he is not being a longer term, looking further than October the 31st at the moment?
You've got to think long term. You've got to think about the next problem but one. You can't just think about a rescue operation in the short term. If you're a government minister, you've got to be planning for the next stage and then the next stage. And I don't think they've anticipated that now they're introducing tougher health regulations. So they're preventing people, in a sense, being able to do a full day's work or a company to open in the same way. And yet at the same time, they're abandoning the support that was available when these restrictions, sometimes lesser restrictions, were in place. So they've got to change the furlough scheme. It could be for part-time work. It could be by sector, the most needy sectors, the ones that are in most difficulty, but have the chance of recovery. In Germany, this scheme for part-time work is extending right through to the end of 2021. In France, it's the same. And if you look at the figures, I mean, Britain has put aside, some people say 50 billion, some people say 30 billion for the recovery plan. But we know that in Germany, it's 100 billion. In France, it's just under 100 billion. In America, they're debating something between 1 trillion and 2 trillion. And that's really, 10 times what we're doing in Britain proportionally. So you've got something to catch up on in Britain. We're behind the curve on preparing for the next stage. He's got to get, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have got to understand, particularly in those areas of the north, in the inner cities, Scotland and Wales, where we will come together and we will press the government to take action. And we will do so representing Scotland, Wales, the regions of England, and the cities, inner cities in London. And we will show them that the public are fearful of what's going to happen and that they are demanding action now. And you cannot put people in a suspended animation and say that you're going to lose your job after October the 31st and there's little that we can do about it. Unemployment is not an act of God. It's a decision that governments make about whether they do something about it.
And is your fear, from your perspective, your experience, that the government is thinking and spending small when the problem is huge?
They've spent a lot, and I supported what they did. So did Keir Starmer, Annalise Dodds. They supported the furlough scheme, but they haven't thought ahead to the next stage. And yes, the Treasury will, as usual, be trying to save money, and they're entitled to look at what is inefficient spending. But you cannot deny the fact that we cannot afford not to invest in the future. You see, if you lose these jobs and lose these skills and lose the capacity in lots of businesses, it'll take years to rebuild it. We're in a once-in-a-century pandemic, once-in-a-century crisis. It's not something that is going to happen tomorrow again if we're fortunate. And so you've got to have once-in-a-century measures to deal with that. And that's why they cannot afford to withdraw the stimulus now.
And your list of your proposals, demands on the Alliance for Full Employment, an employment obligation on the Bank of England, not just reduce interest rates, but also the idea of taking stakes, buying shares, the state buying shares in struggling companies.
You see, you've got loads of companies at the moment who've taken a government loan to tide them through. They haven't been able to get any income because they're not selling anything, or they're not able to sell much to their clients. So they're now struggling through. They will have to invest in the future. Otherwise, they're not going to be competitive. Some will have to go online. Some will have to develop new technologies. I mean, the way we do things, go on holiday, the way we sort of spend our money is going to change quite dramatically as a result of this crisis. So they've got to be prepared for everything. But if you can't invest when you have to repay these loans, and yet you're a good company that is going to survive because you've got an innovative technology, or you've got new ideas to sell, then you need some help. So why doesn't the growth fund, which has been set up under governments, take and have regional hubs? Because there should be one for the Northeast, the Northwest, Scotland, Wales, and so on. And say, when we find a company when we find a company that's in difficulty, we will help them. And if necessary, and if it's possible, we will buy shares in that company so that the return from us lending money to them comes to the public as well as to them for their enterprise. So you've got to keep these thriving, modern, innovative companies going so that they can continue to employ people. But if you're just going to call back the loans and leave it in the hands of the banks, these companies will be dead.
Yeah, there was a temporary glitch in the live stream there, Gordon. So the argument is these are otherwise viable, profitable, thriving companies, but they've been hit by the virus. So we get them through the virus, then they can prosper again at the other end, rather than letting them go to the wall during the pandemic.
That's right. The problem is that the banks will make the decision about whether they are to keep going. The banks will call in the loans at some stage. The companies will become zombie companies, essentially. But if they're going to thrive in the new world, they will have to invest in new products and in new ways of doing things. And they want to keep their workforce on. Why don't we buy shares in these companies so the return when they're successful comes to the taxpayer as well? But don't put it through the banks, put it through the growth fund, where we have experts who understand how companies work, understand what's going to be successful, understand that you've got to take into account more than just the short-term, day-to-day financial position of that company.
Yeah, Tony Brim's saying the biggest employers in this country are small businesses. What should be done to help us? Is there something specific that can be tailored for all those small companies? You know, people who've often invested their life savings, mortgaged their homes, they're taking great risks, and all of a sudden they're just finding their livelihoods are being taken away or in danger of being lost.
That's one of the things that I've been suggesting for small firms, that you can help them, get the growth fund involved, let it give them some help to keep going and modernize their equipment so that they're actually ready to sell the new products and the new services that people want. You know, you can do rates holidays, of course, you can do that for the high streets. You can actually help with retraining, because a lot of the employees will need to retrain. You've got a better advice services. I was talking to the First Minister of Singapore, the Economic Minister, the Senior Minister of Singapore. What they're doing is that they've created an internet platform that gives all the kind of services that small business need: advice services, information services, account services. They're actually helping them by providing the platform on the internet where people can do things that are so time consuming for small businesses and take so much money in hiring sort of staff to do accountancy and so on. They're actually helping them. These are things that we can actually do. But of course, the major thing is getting people back and having demand to be able to buy things. So the small businesses depend on people having money to spend, and you don't have money to spend if you've got 3 million unemployed.
Yeah. So in that sense, somebody being unemployed is all our problem, and we can't afford the price of unemployment, because we will all pay in the long run. It's not just a misery for the person, the individual, their family.
Yeah, it's worse than that, Kevin. We destroy their skills and their capacity, and it's no longer, the capacity of the business is no longer available for the recovery. Mm-hmm. If this is indeed a once-in-a-century event, as I think it is, then you can't afford just to allow this capacity to go to waste. It's like closing down all your factories and not understanding that this has been a once-in-a-century event, and you can actually recover if you invest in these institutions and let them thrive. You see, I'm talking to people all the time, people worried sick about their jobs. This is why I started this. I mean, I'm out of politics. I'm 10 years since I was in office, and I feel strongly that any person who is faced with unemployment And it's unnecessary that they should be made redundant, that we've got to step in to help. And, you know, my whole time in politics, I started, as you mentioned, in the 1980s, and we saw the damage that was done. A whole generation of young people, their talents were never properly used because we didn't get them the help they needed in the early 1980s and allow them to have work experience or to have a job. And you meet people all the time who are worried sick about their family finances. I mean, if you are locked down in Preston or Manchester or something, Matt Hancock announced a scheme. You've got to stay at home because it's unsafe for you to go to work. It's in the public health interest that you don't go to work and pass on any infection. But what does he offer them? £91 a week to feed a family. That could be a family of 4 or 5 or 6. And he's offering only £91. This is not fair. We've got to help those people who are forced to stay at home because of new health restrictions. And we've got to keep them in work as far as is possible, if necessary, by saying work part-time or part-time from home, and we'll pay the rest. The government can pay the rest.
That leads directly, Gordon, to a question from Victoria Ann Peake, who's asking what could be done to help working families in terms of support for isolation, redundancies, mortgage holidays, and so on. Anecdotally, I hear time after time that people with symptoms still go to work because they can't afford not to. I just wonder whether people returning from holiday, spots on the list, are actually quarantining because support is so low. Do you think unless we give more help to those people who are asked to stay at home, they're going to be tempted to go out?
In these last few weeks, I've seen the worst of it. There was a mother in Glasgow who died from malnutrition because she couldn't get any help whatsoever. And a child was found with her, and that kid was suffering from malnutrition. She could get no help whatsoever, and that is unacceptable in a civilized society. So you start with people who've got no income or little income at all, and you've got to help them. Then you've got to look at people who are forced to stay at home, and that's why they've got to give something close to the wage that you were earning before. You can't just say £91 a week and feed and pay the rent and pay all the expenses for a family with children who are of school age and have got great needs. I mean, this is not right, and it's an insult to ask people to live on that. And the sick pay level in Britain is too low, and it's got to be higher. And then you're dealing with other people who are who've lost their jobs, and so limited unemployment help, put on universal credit, amazing number of additional claims for universal credit, but not enough for people to live on. And so child poverty rates are rocketing upwards in this country. And you feel for families where your kids have been at home, they've been locked up for weeks and months. You haven't got the money to pay for the entertainment or even the food that they need. And this is a very unfair society. This is one law for the elite who are getting the dividends unfrozen from the shares that they own, and one law for the rest, because the minimum wage, the living wage, is about to be frozen next April at a time when we are supposed to be rewarding those people on minimum wages who've been serving the community, risking their lives in care homes. The government's proposal is to freeze the living wage. And I think that's completely unacceptable.
Is there a figure you think people should be paid, a proportion of their wages if they're asked to lock themselves up, isolate, quarantine? Do you think it should be similar to the rate of the furlough scheme, where that's 60, 70, 80% of earnings?
For some people, it would have to be 100%. Otherwise, they'd be in absolute poverty. For other people, you know, the 80% rate was what was decided in the furlough. I think probably it could be a sectoral scheme. You know, some sectors are coming back quite quickly, some sectors are not. Where there's a local lockdown, you've really got to help people, because you don't want them to go to work and pass on the infections. You know, they've done the surveys and they find that about 20% are fully self-isolating as opposed to 100% when they're asked to do so. But one of the main reasons is that people have got to get to work to make money to pay for their family's food. Mm-hmm. And so we're finding that half the people who are not obeying the self-isolation rules are people who feel that they don't have enough income and they've got to go to work. So we've got to help people avoid the spread of infection diseases. And that's why, look, in the 1870s, which is 150 years ago, when there was a smallpox outbreak in Britain, in particular cities, they were providing wage support for people. And if you could do that 150 years ago, you can do that after October the 31st.
Jean Vines is asking, do you think a universal basic income could be the way forward?
Well, Jean, that's a really interesting question. You know, in Britain, our universal basic income is free healthcare, and it's free education, and it's child benefit for every family. And that's how we have done, certainly under Labour, a universal basic income. The problem then is, at what level would you set a universal basic income? Because if you set it at too high a level, it becomes unaffordable. If you set it at too low a level, you don't get people out of poverty. And that's why I preferred the tax credit scheme. So you have child benefit, minimum wage, universal benefits, and then on top of that, you help those who need help most. You help those who are in poverty unless you do something special for them. So if you take the tax credit, we were paying out about £100 a week to families of 2 or 3 in tax credits on top of child benefit. And together, that was about £100 a week for extra for the family. If you did that for universal basic income, you paid me or Kevin or someone else £100 a week, then that is money in a sense that is not going to relieving poverty. It's just going to make people who have got some have more. So I would prefer to see the basic income as the child benefit and the pension, of course, and to see it as free healthcare and free education. But we've got to do more to help people whose needs are greatest. And you can only do that by targeting support to people who are really in desperate need.
All right, thank you for that. Somebody using the name AP Politics Fan 1 asks, how can we fix the UK's productivity and investment stagnation as we tackle the coming wave of mass unemployment? I know productivity was something that kind of obsessed you when you were Chancellor in PM. And it's
really interesting because productivity has fallen so far that in the last 10 years, it's only 0.4% per hour increase. And David Sainsbury, Lord Sainsbury, who was our science minister, has just written a book called Windows of Opportunity. And he's looking at what's happened to productivity in Britain. So if you're a North Sea oil worker, because mainly it's the wealth from the oil that is creating the additional revenue, productivity is about £500 per hour, which is quite huge. In manufacturing, it's only £50 per hour, but in some services, it's about £20 per hour. And what he's saying is that some of the high productivity services and manufacturing are not increasing in the relative share in the economy, but they're decreasing. And that really explains why productivity is far lower than it should be. Now, we're not going to get industries like North Sea oil every day, which has such a high level of wealth generation. And it's now half the share it was in the economy 10 years ago. So productivity is bound to be affected by that. But we could support the innovative science base. Look, Britain's got these great scientists. We're proving that over the pandemic, people who are inventing vaccines. We've got wonderful scientists in the IT field. I mean, British companies just been sold for billions in the last 2 days. And probably it would have been far better if we could have kept it in Britain. So we have great, productive, innovative people, geniuses in science and so on. We've got to make more of them. And I just think the government's got to do more to help them. You take Europe, we're part of the Horizon scheme. We're about to leave it. You take Erasmus, we're part of the Skills scheme. We're about to leave it. Cooperation in science and in education is really vital. So even on pragmatic grounds, it's not an issue of whether you're for or against Europe now. It's an issue of whether you're for or against cooperation in science and cooperation in education to get the best for Britain. We should be joining these. And I think there's a campaign that I'm involved in to try and persuade the government on pragmatic grounds. It's far better to be part of these European programs so that we can get the benefits of people working together in science and in education.
Yeah. Ian asks, actually, are there really any economic benefits of leaving the European Union, particularly during the COVID crisis?
Well, overall, no. I mean, I don't want to re-enter this this debate, but I think we've got to look at the moment at 2 cliff edges. Now, is it possible to go over 2 cliff edges at once? I don't think so, but there are 2 cliff edges. One is October the 31st when the furlough scheme ends, and some big redundancies, I'm afraid, are going to happen, and we're trying to avoid that. And the second is December the 31st, but it comes to a head in October, probably around the same date, when we have to sign or not sign an agreement with Europe. And so we're putting at risk our trade at a time when we're trying to restore our trade. I mean, this is the irony. There'll be less trade with Europe, undoubtedly, because of leaving the European Union. But we need actually more trade so that we can recover from a very low that we've reached in the last few months. And again, I would appeal, this is a ridiculous argument about breaking the international law. I mean, the government should never have got into a position where we who have been lawmakers in so many different respects have become the law breakers. And now they're compounding it by saying that Parliament should decide that it wants to break the law as well as the government. And that's what the amendment is being discussed, I think, today. We should be cooperating with other countries on a pragmatic basis to get the best deal for Britain. And it doesn't rule out being tough with Europe, but it does mean that we've got to find ways that we can protect our science and our industries and our trade.
Yeah. Breezy 49 is asking how you would have handled the crisis differently.
I would have done testing right at the beginning, mass testing. When we had the financial crisis, we had to get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem was we were running capitalism, or the banks were running capitalism without capital. And so we had to we had to nationalize some of the banks. When this crisis broke out, it was clear we did not have a vaccine. We did not have a cure. We did not have something that could take the disease away. So we had to detect it early. So we had to test all the time. And there should have been millions of tests being done, not just a few hundred and then a few thousand, and now I think 200,000 a day. I think this figure of 10 million is probably quite close to the truth. There is a new saliva test that's being developed that could be taken instantly with instant results. You, I, and all the people watching this could be taking it every day or every second day or every third day just to be absolutely sure. You could then go out to events on the basis that you knew that day you were not infected with it. Even though you didn't have the symptoms, you might have been infected without checking with the test. And so the big failure right at the beginning, in my view, was not to test and then track. They suspended testing for a month because they thought we'll have herd immunity. And so they lost a vital month. Then they didn't build up testing quickly enough. And then when we need tests urgently in particular areas of the country, they don't have the tests available. And so this is a huge failure, I'm afraid, for which people are paying heavily, some people with their lives. And I believe in a crisis, you've got to get to the root of the problem first. You've got to understand what you need to do. And then you've got to use maximum force to get that done. That's what we tried to do in 2009, to prevent people being unemployed, to prevent companies going under, to prevent the mortgage repossessions we'd seen in the 1990s. And I just think that you've got to grasp the problem. You've got to take it head on. You've got to use all the force you can to do the thing that needs to be done. And if I was to identify the biggest failure, of course, there's other failures like Old People's Home, but that's related to testing. It's the failure to test people sufficiently quickly enough, and then to follow through with the tracking system quickly enough so that there was no spread of infections that could have been avoided.
Yeah. Do you also lament the lack of global action and coordination? I remember that global banking crisis, and you were flying around the world, you were on the phone to people. I remember the Excel Centre in East London, which was used as a Nightingale hospital in this crisis. I remember you having a G20 summit. I remember President Obama with us there. The Saudis were there. I mean, everybody.
We had them all there. Yeah.
What do we have now? We had
a plan, Kevin. Yeah. That was the interesting thing. We got all the world leaders, and it was Britain that brought them together. Yeah. We decided to create this organization, a G20 leaders group. We brought people together in London. We had $1 trillion plan that was to underpin the world economy. And I think what happened was that confidence was restored, that people were going to do something about it. Now, if we had had a meeting virtually of the G20 that was as effective as that now, then people would have had confidence that we were going to provide help so that disease would not spread throughout lots of countries, that we were going to underpin the economy and people could have confidence that it was going to come back to recovery, and we would have avoided a lot of the redundancies. And of course, now we need it more than ever, because you need to coordinate the recovery in such a way that you can guarantee to people that there is enough demand in the economy so that you can stay in your job, and so you can have a livelihood with income, so that people can retain their homes. I mean, global cooperation, you're dealing with a global disease, you're dealing with a global economic recession, you need global action. And I don't think the government or other governments, particularly President Trump, believes that anything other than in America first and forget about the rest. It's really sad.
Is Trump the big reason you can't have global coordination? He's pulled out the World Health Organization. He's at war with, well, verbally and trade-wise with China. UK, we're becoming isolationists, taking ourselves away from our main trading partners. But do you think it's Trump?
Well, I think he is trying to form an international coalition of anti-internationalists. They want to go their own way. So you got America first, Russia first, China first, India first, to some extent Britain first, I'm afraid. But I know that these problems can't be solved without coordinated action. And it's not Trump that's preventing that in a sense. It's actually, you need one leader around the world, or one or two, who are going to say to each other, we are going to act together on this. We have got to find a way to get the vaccine as quickly as possible. So we've got to cooperate. We've got to find a way to prevent the disease coming from poorer countries into richer countries. So we've got to help poorer countries. We've got to get trade and growth moving again. So we've got to underpin the economy. Now, I think you need one or two leaders who are prepared to do that, and then things can change.
Yeah. Do you think we get the leadership from Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister?
You're wanting me to be very personal about Boris.
I do, actually. Yeah, I know you feel free. I always am about him.
I can say a lot about him, and maybe later. But I think at the moment I'm more interested in getting people together to do something important. I was saying, by the way, that there's only two Latin words. You know, he speaks Latin words and Latin phrases all the time. The only two he doesn't seem to ever be willing to utter are mea culpa, that I'm to blame for something. You know, I think an admission of what went wrong is sometimes necessary before you can get things right.
Yeah, he presented himself as a Roosevelt with a New Deal, which quickly fell apart when there was no extra spending. But DML's messaged and saying, do you think we should go for massive infrastructure building, new schools, council housing, to generate jobs, boost towns, revive businesses, and get the economy moving? Do you think there's a moment for the public sector to spend?
Yeah. It's really interesting, Kevin. Liam Byrne, who's the mayoral candidate in Birmingham, has just sent me yesterday his analysis of what could actually be done to front load existing infrastructure projects. So you get them started now rather than 2 years from now. We've got lots of hospitals that should be built. We've got lots of schools that need to be refurbished and built. We've got lots of infrastructure programs. So if you're going to spend the money 5 years from now or 3 years from now, why don't you advance them now? You talk about shovel-ready projects. Now, where they are ready, they should just get going, and we should get people back into work by making sure that we can get the infrastructure needed. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2009, it was far more expensive to do this because interest rates were at 4 or 5%. In 2020, interest rates are roughly 0.5%. So for the government to spend on its infrastructure now, rather than 10 years ago, or rather than later, is a very good and better and more effective investment because it costs so much less for it to be done. So you can build a school at a far cheaper price now. You can build a hospital at a far cheaper price. You can do all these infrastructure projects, but get to them now. Again, I worry about the lack of urgency in the government to get these things underway. You get all these statements, and then how many times have 40 hospitals been announced in the last 2 years? I mean, where are these hospitals? Are they up and running? You know, where's the ground being cut for them to be done?
Yeah, I think there are 6 actually, not 40, aren't there? Really, if we drill down on their record.
You know, we built dozens of hospitals. I mean, we doubled the expenditure on the health service during the Labour government, and we made it our business to get people into proper modern healthcare facilities, whether they were doctors' surgeries or health centres or hospitals. And there is a chance to do this at a far more economical price than was true 10 years ago.
Yeah, but the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he talks the talk on shovel-ready projects and getting them going, but he doesn't seem to have walked the walk yet. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a lack of urgency, or is it just something more ideological about him that he actually really just can't commit to the degree of public intervention that's needed?
Throwing me into comments about a personality. Look, I think in a crisis, you've not only got to be one step ahead of things, and I'm not sure that the government has been one step ahead. I think it's been day-to-day, mainly public relations management all too often, and not getting down to the task of doing the things that are necessary. Otherwise, we would have had the testing equipment available. But it's also seeing what the next problem is. And the next problem was always going to be, how do you recover with infrastructure, with a youth employment program, with help for companies if they're innovative but can't borrow money and can't invest as a result and therefore fall behind? I could have told them these were the problems that, you know, 6 months ago that you would have to deal with now. And although the health situation is worse than we expect it to be, and that means the furlough has got to be extended, it's still the case that we've got to build the infrastructure. It's still the case we've got to have a real plan. You see, take young people. There are 500,000 young people in Britain who've left school, left education, left college in the last few weeks. There are 250,000 young people unemployed. You've got this massive number of young people, and there are 3.5 million young people under 25 who are not in full-time education. Now, the most that the government can offer is 350,000 places. Now, that's just not good enough. I mean, you're only going to cover a fraction of the youth unemployed if you do that. And so they've got to expand the scheme. They should have been alert to the fact that we need more college, more university, more training, more apprenticeship places, and we're going to get that in place. And then you need to make good the deal that you're going to guarantee everybody a job, training, or education. We're behind the curve. We've got to move quickly. They should bring people in to get this done and get it up and running as fast as possible.
Yeah. Do you think this is an opportunity to tackle the housing crisis raised by Syed in a question, particularly young professionals? Syed's a young professional. It's just wider that we could. There is a housing crisis. And
I think local authorities have got a role to play here, because I think it's private companies are not going to be as keen to take on young people as they were even 10 years ago, because they're laying off staff themselves. So we've got to persuade these companies to do more. I think local authorities, and I'm glad that 1,200 council leaders, 70 leaders of councils have signed this appeal for an alliance for full employment. So council got role to play. Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, and he talked a lot about retrofitting. He talked a lot about a housing program that could actually get people into work, but also deal with the climate change problems and reduce carbon emissions and everything else. So yeah, the Green New Deal is something that is really important. Europe's got one. We should be working with them, to be honest. America will have one soon if President Biden's elected. There could be a global New Deal where we learn from each other about how to reduce carbon, how to decarbonize some of our industries, and how to get our houses and our homes better fitted for the environmental challenges we face.
The final question to put to you, sent in, Gordon, is from Gary, who says, is Cummings to blame? Now, referring to Dominic Cummings, I imagine you could look at that two ways. One is he seems to be a large part of Boris Johnson's brain. And then the second is what happened in County Durham, Barnard Castle, the eyesight test. There was such a public revulsion over the fact he broke lockdown rules and wasn't disciplined or punished by the Prime Minister. That I heard people say, you could see it in polls, you could hear it from Conservative MPs, that other people saying, why should I comply and make sacrifices when those at the top are not following the rules they dictate to the rest of us?
If anything is going to be remembered from this crisis, and there are many things, it's going to be that there was one law for Dominic Cummings and the Downing Street elite, or whoever you call them, and one law for the rest of us. One law for the grouse shooters this week, who are able to assemble together, and another for the rest of us. One law for those people who are getting dividends and the government's unfreezing the dividend payments so that they can get lots of money from their shares, and one law for the rest who are on a living wage who are seeing it frozen. So one unfrozen, another frozen. And I think this idea that, the Tories used to say, we're all in this together. I mean, I'm afraid they have got to do far more than they're doing at the moment to build the sense of national unity you need to deal with a crisis. And I would be, it wouldn't be Dominic Cummings that would be visiting the North, but I think sort of government ministers would do well to visit the North and to visit Scotland and to visit Wales and to hear what's happening in the Midlands and to listen to what people are really saying, because I see an anger developing. I see a pain that people are feeling, and I see a great anxiety about the next few months and what sort of Christmas people are going to have if they're going to be laid off. I mean, this is something that the government's got to take into account now, that the people are really suffering. They've suffered from fear of the virus, and now they're suffering from fear of their jobs.
Gordon, thank you very much for joining us today on this Daily Mirror Facebook Live. You have your campaign, the Alliance for Full Employment. We're trying to keep Britain working. I think we have a common interest. And
we've got a site, Alliance for Full Employment, which is on the website. You've been running this great campaign. I commend the Mirror. I hope we can talk about specific proposals in the next few weeks that we have to deal with youth unemployment, to deal with saving businesses from bankruptcy, to deal with what we can do about the furlough. Something will be coming out in the next few days. And I hope the government, with the support of the Mirror, 1,200 local councillors, all these great mayors who are doing a fantastic job in their own areas, under-recognised in the whole of Britain, the job that these guys, Andy Burnham, Steve, Jamie, Merv and Sadiq and Dan are doing. I mean, and the First Minister of Wales, we really have to work together to solve this crisis.
Yeah, well, let's all be in this together to keep Britain working and avoid mass unemployment. Thank you very much, Gordon Brown.
Thanks, a pleasure, Kevin. Take care.